Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Williams, the Director of College Music at St Hilda's College, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this, the first of two events taking place on one of the most important dates in our college calendar, our day celebrating the founding of St Hilda's College 127 years ago. With me is my colleague, Dr Gareth Evans, a specialist in, amongst other things, Old Norse, Old English, and medieval literature. And with Gareth is one of his talented English students, Elena Vermeer, here in her first term at Oxford. And we have two musicians, two composers, music finalist Danny Riley, and former St Hilda's music graduate, Dr Chris Ferebee, who's dialing in from Canada on a very secure line. So far, so good. And can I welcome also two colleagues working behind the scenes, making all this possible. Triona Adams, who's organised this event, and Harris, our technical wizard. Thank you all. So why are we here? We're here to explore Caedmon's hymn. Why are we doing that? Well, because we have a tradition here at college that every year Caedmon's hymn is set to music by a music student and then performed at our Founders' Day service at the University Church. Now I've heard that in Oxford, for something to become a custom, it has to take place once, and if it takes place twice, it's a tradition. Well, I'm old enough to remember, and I've been at college long enough, and my memory is good enough to remember that it was in fact me who started the tradition at my very first Founders' Day in November 2006. I was looking for items for my first Founders' Day occasion. I was researching St Hilda and looking for music associated with St Hilda. And in fact, she's rather neglected compared to other saints. There's quite a bit of music for St Peter, St Paul, St Catherine, and of course, St Cecilia. So to have found Caedmon's hymn, it was really thrilling. It's a beautiful poem. It's the perfect length and has a lovely message. So I invited a music student to set it to music, and from those roots, this tradition has sprung up and blossomed. And now we have 9 or even 10 settings of the poem. And in 2020, it's Danny's turn. He's composed the setting. We recorded it on Tuesday, and he'll tell us a little bit about it later, before its premiere during the service at 5 o'clock. There's an age-old rivalry about what comes first. Is it the music or the words? Well, today we really have to begin with the words. So it's my great pleasure to invite Gareth and Elena to tell us a little bit more about the text of Caedmon's hymn.
Wonderful, thanks, Johnny. Okay, so to begin with, Elena is going to read the poem out loud in Old English for us. And then I'm going to provide a quite literal translation into modern English. And then, as you said, we thought we'd talk a little bit more about the context of the poem, picking out some of its literary features as well. So, Elena?
Yeah, so in Old English, the poem runs like this. Nu shilon herdian, heaven reaches ward, met with his mechty and his modiedank. Werk wulde vader, sway he wundra je was, eich richten, or a stelida. He erist shop elde barnu, heaven till rofe, hale scheppen. Dan bitun yard, monkenes ward, eich richten. After tede firum foldu, Freya almechty.
Wonderful, thanks, Elena. And in modern English, following the syntax of the original, that would be something along the lines of this. So, now we must praise the guardian of the kingdom of heaven, the might of the Creator and his mind's purpose, the work of the Father of glory, as he of every wonder, the eternal Lord, established the beginning. He first shaped for the children of men heaven as a roof, the holy Creator. Then Middle Earth, the guardian of mankind, the eternal Lord, afterwards created the earth for the people, the Lord Almighty. So here we clearly have a religious poem praising God for his act of creation. But to really appreciate this poem and the poem's significance, and moreover, I think, its relation to St. Hilda and also its relevance for St. Hilda's College today, we need a bit of context. So it is in the Venerable Bede's 8th century ecclesiastical history of the English people that we learn of the story of St. Hilda and the poet Caedmon. St. Hilda lived in the 7th century and was the founding abbess of the monastery at the place which is called Streoneshach, which thankfully today is the more pronounceable Whitby. And for the first 33 years of her life, she followed a secular path. But she dedicated the remainder of her life, another 33 years, to God through monastic devotion. And as abbess at Whitby, Hilda was renowned for her wisdom and her learning. And the Venerable Bede tells us that kings and princes would visit her to ask for her advice and counsel. And beyond simply asking for her advice, they would act upon her advice as well.
Yeah, so while Hilda was of noble birth, Caedmon was an illiterate cowherd who worked for the abbey in Whitby. So Bede tells us that he originally had no knowledge of poetry whatsoever and was entirely unable to compose lyrics or songs. So Bede tells us that Caedmon was so incapable at composing that when he attended feasts at which all the guests were invited to compose, to sing, and to entertain each other, he would feel so inept that he would be compelled to leave when he saw the harp coming towards him, indicating that he would have to sing. On one of these occasions, Caedmon left and went to tend to the cows of the monastery. After tending to them, he fell asleep and dreamed that a man appeared to him and asked him to sing.
Yes, and specifically he tells him to, in Old English, sing me frumschaft, which means sing to me of creation, or sing to me of the beginning of all things. And suddenly, even miraculously, he is able to do so. And he does this, we are told, using words and phrases that Caedmon has never heard before. And the poem he produces, which we now know as Caedmon's Hymn, is of course the one that Elena read for us so well just a few minutes ago. And when Caedmon awakes from the dream, he is able to remember the poem, and more than that, he now has the newfound ability to compose verse and to sing. And Hilda is told of Caedmon's newfound ability to compose and is, of course, delighted that God has given Caedmon such a wondrous gift. And Hilda encourages Caedmon to take up the monastic way of life, which he does, and he is instructed by the other monks in sacred law and in the stories of the Bible. And from that point onwards, Caedmon is able to compose beautiful poetry on any sacred topic to which he turns his hand. And we are also told that he is only able to produce poetry on Christian topics, which is often taken as further proof of the gift's divine origin. Now, although we are told that he composed widely, unfortunately, the only surviving poem that we can and do identify as Caedmon's now is the poem we call Caedmon's Hymn. And as a tutor at St. Hilda's, I think one of the things that really stands out to me in this story of the poem's origin is the role that Hilda takes on as a patron of learning and a patron of education as well. And she is shown to be someone who fosters individual talents regardless of their background. Now, as an illiterate cowherd, Caedmon would really have been among the lowest of the low in terms of his social status within his community. So that it is Caedmon who receives this gift, is recognized by Hilda, and has his talents fostered by her is striking. And this, of course, is what I think St. Hilda's College has really done over its history in enabling those historically excluded from an Oxford education in gaining one. And this, 1300 years after Caedmon first uttered his poem, is, I think, what St. Hilda's College is still trying to do in terms of promoting and fostering both excellence and equality. So Hilda, I think, really works as a model for us today. But let's now look at the poem itself in a little more detail. And I think it's going to appear on screen for us again in a second. So Caedmon's hymn is one of the oldest and perhaps the oldest recorded example of Old English poetry. Now, this is not to say that Caedmon was the first to produce Old English poetry, as he is sometimes claimed to be. The very fact that poetry was being sung at the feasts which Caedmon leaves in shame suggests that this cannot be the case. And the poem is in a traditional Germanic alliterative meter. And this meter has 4 stresses per full line, with each pair of half lines, and here you can see those half lines split by a caesura, being bound together by alliteration. And through these features, it likely echoes those songs that would have been sung at the gatherings that Caedmon left early when he saw that harp coming towards him. But this isn't to say that there aren't noteworthy or innovative aspects to this short 9-line poem.
Yeah, it seems that traditionally this Germanic alliterative poetry, particularly in pre-Christian contexts, would have been used to praise secular earthly rulers, lords, and kings. But this, of course, is not what Caedmon does. So Caedmon uses this traditional form to praise a divine rather than a secular ruler. So he adapts this form for Christian worship. And it's possible that we see this adaptation as Caedmon's innovation, and also a crucial intervention into English literary history.
Absolutely, especially when we consider that at the time of the poem's composition, Northumbria had only actually been converted to Christianity for about half a century. So Christianity and these topics that come with Christianity are relatively new to Caedmon, and the conversion is effectively within living memory for Caedmon. So although this poem might seem slight and perhaps even pedestrian to us in its simplicity, it's important not to forget its potential innovation when we take into account its context. Elena, would you like to start us off by pointing out some of the interesting literary features in this poem for us?
Sure. So this is a very tightly bound poem. Quite a lot is crammed into these 9 lines. So usually we understand this poem as falling into 2 halves. The first half, covering the first 4 lines, suggests that we should praise God for his wondrous creation. And then the second half, the next 5 lines, as you can see on the screen, defines 2 principal parts of this creation, the heavens and the earth. So we can see a very clear progression as we move through this poem from the first to the second half. Another interesting thing I think that Caedmon does is he uses traditionally secular vocabulary to discuss Christian themes. So again, he's taking secular forms and adapting it to Christian worship, just like the alliterative meter that the poem employs. One of the most important instances of this is in the use of the word drichten in the phrase Eche drichten, or eternal Lord, in lines 4 and again in line 8. The word drichten, or Lord, can have a secular meaning, referring to the Lord in a Lord-retainer relationship or an earthly ruler. But Caedmon repurposes this word, referring instead to an Eche drichten, an eternal Lord. And so he's talking about the Christian God rather than a secular Lord.
Yes, I think that's actually an incredibly important point. And here in this poem, we perhaps see the earliest example of the blending.
Lord-retainer relation.
Oh, sorry. I think there's something. Oh, sorry. I had double sound. I don't know if Eleanor's speaking or not. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry. So as I was saying, I think that's an incredibly important point. And I think here we perhaps see the earliest example of the blending of Christian and heroic elements that really is characteristic of so much Old English poetry. Qualifying that word drifting with Eche redirects our sense of a hierarchy from a secular hierarchy to a Christian hierarchy with God at the apex. And another notable thing to point out here in this poem is really the proliferation, I think, of terms that are used to describe God. And this might actually even seem heavy going or even repetitive to a modern reader. But this is a fantastic example of what in Old English poetics we would call variation, where the same thing, in this case God, is described in multiple ways in parallel clauses. So in these 9 lines, we have 7 different ways of describing God. He is, in line 1, Heavenriches Ward, or the guardian of the kingdom of heaven. In line 2, he's Methodus Mechti, or the mighty measurer. He's the Wuldefader, or the father of glory, in the 3rd line. As Elena mentioned, he's Echedrichten, or eternal Lord, in lines 4 and 8. He's the Hale Sheppen, or the holy creator, or alternatively the holy shaper, in line 6. He's the Monkinus Ward, or the guardian of the kingdom, the guardian of mankind, in line 7. And then finally, in line 9, he's the Freya Almechti, or the almighty ruler. Now, 2 of these, Heavenriches Ward, or the guardian of the kingdom of heaven, and Freya Almechti, or almighty ruler, function in a similar way to that phrase Echedrichten, or eternal Lord, that Elena mentioned, in their repurposing of secular concepts to Christian ends. So instead of, for example, a phrase like Richeward, which would just simply mean the guardian of the kingdom, which would be a secular concept and a way of describing a secular ruler, we now instead get Heavenriches Ward, or the guardian of the kingdom of heaven, and so have that focus instead on the Christian elements of that phrase.
Yeah, and I think we can also think about the way in which Caedmon brings the 2 halves of the poem together by repeating or paralleling phrases, which in turn serves to reinforce the poem's Christian message. So there's the repeated use of Echedrichten in lines 4 and 8 that we have mentioned, where the repetition serves to lend a sense of coherence to the poem. But this repetition also mirrors God's eternal nature by reiterating his unchanging stability across the 2 sections of the poem. Similarly, there are the parallel phrases Heavenriches Ward, guardian of the kingdom of heaven, in line 1, and Monkinus Ward in line 7, the guardian of mankind, that together work in a very similar way to bind the poem together. The slight change in this repetition illustrates how God is not only the guardian of heaven, but also of mankind, also of earth, emphasizing his omnipotent power over everything, but also demonstrating how God is not only a remote deity who's concerned only with the heavens, but is intimately concerned and involved with mankind. He's mankind's guardian. So we see how the poem's repetition lends coherence both structurally, but also in terms of its Christian message.
I think that's a fantastically important point to raise. And I think it also draws attention to the fact that this poem very much seems to be one that has been composed for performance and composed for performance as song as well. And the features we've just spoken about, like repeated phrases, parallel clauses, varied descriptions, the heavy use of alliteration and so on, all seem to lend it to oral and perhaps musical performance. But given the way that this hymn is preserved, this hymn is actually preserved in the margins of Latin manuscripts of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica. It doesn't come down to us along with any musical notation of any kind. So I actually think it's wonderful that other members of this panel are taking on what I imagine is the really quite substantial task of setting this central piece of literary history to music. And well, I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the process of doing so.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Elena. That's really fascinating. And you used the word earlier on, Gareth, that it might be a simple poem, but gosh, it's so rich and sophisticated and developed, it seems to me. Do we know if it's good? Do we know if it's a good poem? How do we begin to compare it with anything else if it's really standing alone, if you like?
So I think that ultimately that's an incredibly difficult question to answer. not least, I think, because notions of literary quality are, of course, kind of so historically contingent, and what we might now think of as a good piece of literature might be kind of very different from, well, kind of 1300 years ago. But I think what we can do with this poem is pick out features where the poem works well as an Old English Germanic poem. So, for example, it does perfectly meet the rules of the alliterative meter in which it's composed. That is, it has 2 stressed syllables per half line, with each half line bound together by alliteration.
And
that
has something in common with Beowulf and other.
Yes, so pretty much, well, actually, all Old English poetry has to follow this alliterative meter in order to be regarded poetry. So it's not so much a case of saying that it's good because it follows this, but simply that it meets the conventions of the poem. We can, of course, pick out the things that Elena and I have been picking out just now in terms of just how much detail is in there, and just how much inventiveness seems to be in the poem in terms of appreciating its innovation. But I'd be kind of wary of myself kind of using the label kind of good or bad. However, Bede thinks it's good. So Bede himself certainly seems to have thought it was a good poem. And when he's writing about it in Latin, he notes that when he's paraphrasing the poem into Latin, that this is an inadequate paraphrase, and that it won't capture the beauty of the original. So he seems to suggest that there's a quality to the original text.
And Bede was writing well over a century after Caedmon wrote it.
Yes.
How would it have been transmitted over those years?
Yes, so that's a really important question. So as I mentioned, we have this poem preserved in the margins of Latin copies of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, his History of the English People. And that text was originally, of course, written in Latin. It seems as if those people who then recorded the text in the margins weren't the original kind of Latin scribes of the manuscript. So we can conjecture that this verse would have been passed around in oral memory. So that this is something that would have survived in kind of oral performance and oral telling, and then eventually would have been written down sometime later on. So to start with kind of oral performance and oral circulation, and then actually quite a time after Bede himself, it then seems to be written down in the margins of Bede's Historia.
It's really fascinating and so rich and very stimulating for a musician. I'm full of ideas hearing you talk about it, the structure, and I just can't believe how similar it is to something I've been studying from the 18th century.
Oh, really?
You know, my work on Jean-Philippe Rameau, the phrase structure is almost identical to that used in French opera and in French plays. So if you look at Racine, if you look at Lully, you look at Rameau in the 18th century, the way their verses are structured are in 2 halves.
Oh, fascinating.
Normally of 6 syllables and another 6 syllables, with a caesura on the half line and with fixed stress points at 6 and 12. And then with mobile stresses in other parts of the half line. And those mobile stresses explain numerous attributes in the music. The music is really utterly dependent on the idiosyncrasies of the versification. So to see that here too, in its own part of its separate tradition, is really fascinating. When one thinks of what poetry normally is, especially English poetry, with meter, iambic pentameter, with rhymes and so forth, to find this parallel is utterly fascinating. So I think we've learned so much from you already, and I'm sure there's more next year. But I'd like to just move on to the music now, to Danny and Chris, and just talk about the very personal approach to a commission to write a choral piece that Danny's done, such as Danny. When being commissioned, so many things flood through the mind. Who's commissioned the music? What are the expectations of that commission? When and why will it be performed, and for what audience? What's the budget? And how many rehearsals will there be? These are all important and very sensitive when writing for a church service. because, as we know, Anglican liturgical music has its very own strong and successful tradition musically. It's hard to write an anthem these days without the influences of Vaughan Williams and David Wilcox and John Rutter flooding through, and perhaps more latterly, Arvo Pärt, James Macmillan, Morton Lauridsen, Eric Whittaker, Ola Yalo, Eschenwalds. It's such a, we live in such a rich choral tradition now with influences from all around the world. Beginning to respond to that for a fixed commission is a fascinating process. So I'd like to turn to Danny now, and he can talk us a little bit about how, when presented with such a rich text and a blank sheet of manuscript paper, what the processes are. So Danny, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And, you know, I have to completely agree, you know, the conditions of doing a commission, such as, you know, the rehearsals and, have really been felt this term under COVID. So it's absolutely fantastic that we're here to be able to do this. So with this setting of Caedmon's hymn, I will sort of just talk through the process of how I got from the blank page to the full page. I'm just going to share my screen. So that should be visible. So yes, sorry. There we are. So here we have the Caedmon's hymn text that you saw before, along with an English translation, which is pretty close. And I'm sure Gareth and Elena will correct any moments in it if there are any that need correcting. But the main thing that struck me about the text was something that Gareth touched on before, which is the emphasis on the repetition rather of these synonyms for the name of God. Now I've highlighted them in red on the English translation, and there are 8 synonyms, 7 really, if you count Ecce Dictin as being repeated, which is significant, as we'll come to see. But it's quite a striking thing to have in a 9-line text 8 different statements for the same thing, and that was it's quite unusual and very important to the text. So I tried to look for ways to take this and make it integral to the musical setting of the piece as well. And at the bottom there, you can see 8 chords, which I can play for you. And each of these chords is associated, or a representation, I suppose, of each of these names. So I created these chords using the sort of serial compositional processes used by Stravinsky, who is, arguably and certainly in my opinion, the greatest sacred music writer, certainly in the latter half of the last century. And basically this involves taking a row of pitches, which you can see at the top, and rotating them around as you can see in the diagrams. And then you get this array of pitches, and by adding them both horizontally and vertically, I created these chords. And from this is the sort of structural basis for which the whole piece kind of unfolds in a somewhat more looser manner as the piece progresses. But this is the work that underpins the whole piece. So as you can see here, this is an example of how those chords that I just showed you are derived from that particular array of chords. And this is important to me because it gives the piece a sort of meaningful structural basis that reflects the peculiarities and importance of the original text that's being set. And it's a lovely sort of sound that reflects the sort of sonorities of the text itself, as Gareth and Elena mentioned before. There's a lot of alliteration, and it gives, you know, a really, certainly in the first 4 lines, it's lots of soft consonants. It's nu, shilan, hernyan, hethan, richa, swad. You know, it's all very soft sounding, no harsh consonances. And that's partly why in the opening of the text, of the setting, even as you can see on the screen, it's a very sort of lyrical and atmospheric start, which way of reflecting the significance of the text. And yes, so the other thing the other main structural sort of background musical sort of underpinning of the whole piece comes from Ecce Dictum, which I'm very glad Gareth and Elena touched on as being repeated, because it's an incredibly important moment. And I've noticed and this is my 3rd year here, so I've heard 2 other settings of these whilst I've been here, and in each one, Ecce Dictum seems to always be brought out by the composers. It's just got a real resonance in the text, and I think maybe that's partly because it's suddenly a much harsher or cleaner sort of consonants, Ecce Dictum, you know, compared to the first 3 lines. It's quite a contrast. So it always seems to be musically quite important in the settings. And here, I've sort of emphasized that by taking the 4th and 7th chords of this progression, with each chord representing a statement of the name of God. So the 4th and 7th iterations are correlate with Ecce Dictum in its 2 appearances. So using a sort of Boulesian technique, I've multiplied them together to create this chord, which is quite hard to play. You've just about got enough fingers. And this comes through when Ecce Dictum is stated for the first time. And it really does rub against the music you hear beforehand. It's quite an almost shocking appearance, which, you know, is again a reflection of the sonorities of the text. But that's probably enough talking from me. I could talk for hours about sort of the finer details of the entire process, but this is sort of the most crucial aspects, I think. And now we've got an extract of the piece which we can play, so you can actually hear all of the things I just talked about. I might need to stop sharing my screen for that.
I'm not hearing any sound. Oh, there we go.
The audio is working now.
Thank you, Danny. Even though I conducted the piece on Tuesday, some of those points weren't obvious to me. So I'm fascinated how you've been an architect in there building. The blueprint is really strong, and yet it's sublimated as well beneath beautiful textures and sonorities.
Yeah.
And I just want to congratulate you, Danny, because you've had to make lots of changes to this piece since the beginning.
Yes.
You envisaged a performance in University Church with an organ and instruments and a choir of 40, and yet you've really gone beyond the call of duty to adapt it and done so with great grace. So thank you for that, and good luck for the premiere this evening.
Thanks.
Now I'd like to call in Canada. I'd like
Georgia.
Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Now, I'm ashamed to say that your version of Caedmon's hymn is not one that was commissioned for a Founders Day. Instead, you responded quite personally to the text.
I did, yeah. It kind of came about from a project that St. Hilda's produced very, very kindly. I went to folks, particularly Bronwyn Travers, Martin Harry, and with this incredibly crazy idea, and they very kindly agreed to do it, and it come about from other projects that had been done. And as a matter of fact, I think we have a clip I thought we'd play very quickly, just to give a kind of an idea of what the sound world is like. So yeah, that was so that just kind of gives an idea of the sound world, which is a much folkier sound world, I guess you could say. Very different to Danny's incredibly beautiful piece. I commend you, man. That was fantastic. I wish I could be there to hear the real thing. But yeah, it was. It came about through a collaboration between an early musician named Andrew Archechi, who played viola da gamba and double bass, plays, I shouldn't say in the past tense, plays viola da gamba and double bass. And then sort of the BB King of the English folk world, a guy named Alistair Anderson, who is, I'm pretty sure no one would disagree with the fact that he's the greatest living English concertina player on the planet. And so Alistair and Andrew and I decided to collaborate on this, all this original music and do this recording at the JDP back in 2013, believe it or not, which I can't kind of wrap my head around. But the three of us came up with a bunch of different music, and we then decided to collaborate it from all three angles, from contemporary classical music to early music to folk music. Where do we overlap, and where you know where are the intersections of the Venn diagram? And so for me personally, kind of going back and deciding what to do for this project, St. Hilda has been somebody really important to me for a while, because not only was I at St. Hilda's Oxford, I was also at the College of Hilton Bede at Durham. And so Hilda's kind of been this person that's been with me for a while. And so just like Johnny, I found the hymn through studying St. Hilda, and trying to decide how to set it. And I want to also touch on what Gareth said, because I've got my ecclesiastical history right here. I'm ready to, so I'm actually going to read a little bit of Bede, because trying to decide what to do with the text did I set it in Old English? Did I set it in Modern English? This is what Bede says about it. And Gareth actually said this before, but so this is Bede. This is the sense, but not the words in the order in which he sang them in his sleep. For verses, however well composed, cannot be literally translated out of one language into another. And I'm keeping the irony of me reading this in English and not Latin away from this part. Without losing much of their beauty and integrity. So I couldn't get that passage out of my head as I tried to set the poem, and I thought, well, nobody speaks Old English that much anymore that I'm aware of. So I thought, well, in the end, let's set both languages. We'll do both English and both Modern English and Old English, and that provided some interesting ideas. I mean, because we were doing this as a collaborative project, the really interesting thing about it was, even though we're talking about intersections of Venn diagrams and how does early music and folk music and contemporary classical music, which is the outlier there, how do those three things, how are they going to coexist in this world? What I found really interesting for me was how freeing it became, because being somebody who's a very proud student of Martin Harry, I had been studying a lot of pretty complex and very, very involved contemporary classical music. And I took this opportunity to try and kind of just do something else, but not forget everything that we had been working on. So using ideas like mode and complement and isorhythm, and how to set the text with the caesuras so that those emphases are there in the right places, but even taking it away from more of a formal context. I'm trying not to use the word informal, but that's what it is. It's a folkier thing. And so it is more informal. And I dare say even, I figured it would be okay if I was being genuine, I could do something that was a little bit more on the nose. And so I wanted to utilize sound textures and sonorities and tonalities that meant a lot to me, but not necessarily something that's easily accepted in a more classical, formal setting. And so I utilize things like, for any musicians out there, utilizing the natural minor scale, which in the folk world, if you're starting on a minor 1, you often have a move to a flat major 7. And so the two voices are set not only in their own languages, but then they're also set in their own tonalities, as well as their own ensembles, that eventually, as the piece continues on, they start to come together. And using very, very informally using principles of isorhythm to bring them from far apart to closer together. And I took the opportunity to just kind of be free with it. And getting ready for this talk today, I was listening back to the record and the 3 pieces that I put on it. And I don't typically listen to things that I've written in the past. I tried, it's not healthy. I'm listening to it now thinking, my word, I really was going quite free there. So it was the longest piece on the record, and we had a great time doing it, but there was a lot that was composed, there was a lot that was improvised as well. And I wanted to make sure that everybody involved got a chance to kind of say something of themselves. And our producer, Dan Jeffries, took the sound. So I should say that the piece is written for harmonium or reed organ. So it's a foot pedal organ, an Anglo-Saxon lyre, which is this right here, which I'll talk about in a minute. Viola da gamba, double bass, English concertina, and then a phenomenal baritone named Josh Copeland, and one of my best friends and one of the best folk musicians one of the best musicians I've ever heard in general, a lady named Hannah James. These are the two that sang the 2 different versions of the languages. So Dan Jeffries took the sounds from this old creaky reed organ that James Percival, who was a Hilda student way back when I was there, took the sounds of this old organ and arranged a kind of electroacoustic beginning, middle, and end to it. So that was Dan Jeffries' contribution. I did improvise the lyre, and then Andrew Arcechi improvised a viola da gamba line, which we'll hear a little bit later on as well. And so it was something that I wanted to make sure everybody had a place to say something, which is, in folk music, that's kind of part and parcel with how you do it. So, we had a great amount of fun doing it, and it definitely ended up being one of the ones that kind of stood out on the record, just because it was so different. I'm still so incredibly grateful to St. Hilda's for funding this incredibly crazy project because it was insane. But we had an incredible time doing it. So, so just to talk a little bit about it, because again, trying to be as authentic as I possibly could, I had an instrument maker take a copy from an archaeological site, and I want to say that it was I don't think that they're quite sure if it was either an earl or a king, but somebody of rather high status found this burial site, and inside it was a lyre, and the archaeologists actually put out a sort of mathematical blueprint for how it was made, and so I sent it to an instrument maker who made it out of Georgian yellow pine, which is my home state of Georgia in the U.S. And it's from actually a rather famous mansion in Atlanta that had some work done on that place, and they had all this extra timber, and he made this thing out of that. And so so I've only got 6 notes. That's it. But it's an Anglo-Saxon lyre. One of my very good friends said, you know, if you embodied an instrument, this would be you. And I don't know if I took that as I've only got 6 notes, so I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment. But nevertheless, I've used it quite a bit. It's actually a rather versatile instrument, but it's got a beautiful sound. And and there's all kinds of different things you can do. So we utilized, this is the lyre that we used on the recording. And so now I thought it would be good just to kind of go through the end and let people hear how the 2 voices come together, if that's okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, that's the way the piece basically ends. It kind of fades as it goes out. But yeah, so that's basically my version. So thank you very much for letting me speak about it.
It's beautiful, and 2 such different settings. There's no limit to what can be done with such a strong poem. It's limited only by a composer's imagination. So wonderful contrasts. I didn't know, Chris, that that's what you'd done when we were starting this talk. So it's a perfect contrast. And I always think of you now as not a lyre, but a 6-string lyre. I was going to ask, how do we know how it's tuned? Can you just vary the tuning of the strings according to?
You can. I mean, the instrument maker, we talked a lot about this and talked about tuning, and he you have to take a guess in giving the length of the string from the bridge to the tuning pegs. And so we guessed that it's likely just a G, A, B, C, D, E. And that's that's roundabout what we would expect. I mean, given what we can figure out about, you know, gut strings that are no longer there, and the width of that string, and therefore what kind of pitch it could have taken. So we estimated at around a G, but you know, musical archaeology isn't exactly as fine a science as one would hope for. So, but yeah, so this one, that's the way this one is tuned, and that's also why we've got it in G and A in the tonality in the piece as well.
I don't know if it's a coincidence that that's the note your piece starts on, Danny, a G.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason it starts on a G for me is because it's the only note missing from that 11-note chord for Etchie-Dictin. So G completes the set, but no lyres involved, unfortunately.
So, well, I actually had an interest. I mean, getting into the finer points, because I actually have an F that was out of the tonality that was never allowed to be there until the very end. So I understand.
That brings us to some questions and answers. And we do have one question. I don't know if there's anybody else who'd like to submit one on the chat. Now's the chance. And Bronwyn has asked, to what extent are you guided in your composition by previous settings? And that if there are any pieces which are minimally influenced by any others, it's going to be this, because there are so few. But Danny, you've sung in two others, haven't you? You sang in Cassie's?
Yeah, Cassie White and Tom Carr, they were both absolutely fantastic settings, you know, and I think to some extent they do have an influence, partly because, you know, there's a certain when you get like 15 singers into a room, there's a certain ambiguity on how to actually pronounce Old English. So every year it's slightly different, and I think you kind of stick with what you know to a point. Kind of, you know, having heard it 2 times, I know what sounds good with certain aspects of the text. So you kind of have it's almost like having a head start on what not to do and what, you know, can work, and kind of gives you a good frame of reference in a way you're lucky to have for something like this. And I think especially, as I said, Etchie-Dictin in every setting, that's got quite a prominent part in both of the previous texts. And I think, you know, all the previous composers kind of spotted the sort of acoustic difference of that line. And, you know, it was part, you know, it was interesting to hear that in 2 previous settings as well before approaching this one.
Well, it's drawing to the time we need to be finishing this session. Some of us are rushing into college now to do the Founders Day service. I don't see any more questions coming in, but do get in touch with any of us another time if you rewatch this and more ideas occur to you for questions, and we'll do our best. So, but I'll begin to wrap up by saying thank you, everyone, for taking part. Thank you, Chris and Danny and Elena and Gareth and Harris and Triona. Thank you for making this session possible. It's endlessly fascinating, and I just want to know more about this poetry. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I just find it really fascinating that this poem is an extraordinary product of the so-called Dark Ages. And out of that darkness, Caedmon and Hilda shine really brightly. And the theme of dark and light is one which will feature in our service at 5 o'clock. So do tune in at 5 o'clock to hear our service. You'll be present to hear the premiere of Danny's Caedmon's hymn. And also you can hear an address by the Venerable Sam Rushton, who's the Archdeacon of York and a former Hilda student, who will be talking about Hilda. And also you can listen to readings and prayers of many faiths, and some live music too, live from the JDP, performed by students at staff here at college. There's time to put the kettle on before 5 o'clock, but I hope we'll see you in just about an hour. And thank you very much once again, all of you. Thank you.